Hi. We are so happy to welcome you to Harvard Divinity School and tonight's Interfaith Awareness Week event, Contours of Common Ground. I'll say before I start the introduction that there was a slight mix-up with location, I think, in some of the publicity that went out, so there may be people coming in as we begin to get started from across the street. This event is co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of World Religions and the Pluralism Project. And my name is Lucia Holsether, and I'm a Harvard Divinity School student completing a field education internship at the CSWR. Last fall, I met with my co-planner for this event, April Weinbrenner-Palo, an intern at the Pluralism Project, for a discussion about the dynamics of interfaith work in our respective organizations. Out of our conversation emerged several questions about the dynamics of interfaith work. We noted together that interfaith leaders often draw on the example and rhetoric of public leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, and Abraham Joshua Heschel, all of whom guided controversial movements and risked alienation, arrest, and death for their commitments. Many contemporary interfaith organizations have identified themselves with this legacy, even as they have stressed a search for common ground amidst diversity. And we started thinking about these two things that interfaith organizations say and do. We wondered, do these radical historical legacies ever conflict with common ground? Does this search for common ground complicate interfaith organizations' abilities to take resolute stances on divisive social and political issues? These questions contain the seeds of tonight's panel and discussion. We have gathered 5 scholars and practitioners who are actively engaged with interfaith work. To guide their reflections, we asked them to consider the following questions. Within the multifaceted world of interfaith work, what is common ground? How does highlighting common ground impact interfaith organizations' ability to address major political questions and participate in social movements beyond their own? Is common ground a standalone goal, or does it imply additional ethical and political commitments? Before we begin the formal presentations from our 5 panelists, whom April will introduce in a moment, I would like to introduce 2 of our panelists who have made this event possible and who will make brief welcoming introductions. First, Whittney Barth, Assistant Director of the Pluralism Project, will come up to the podium. And second, Professor Francis X. Clooney of the Center for the Study of World Religions will welcome us on behalf of the Center for the Study of World Religions. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Whittney to the podium.
Good evening. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you this evening. I'd like to start by thanking Professor Clooney and the Center for the Study of World Religions for making this event possible and for being willing to co-host with the Pluralism Project. We're really excited about this partnership this evening and hope that something will come out of it and continue in the future. And I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists for being here. It's truly an honor to be at this table with the 4 of you whose work I admire very deeply. And next, I'd like to especially thank April and Lucia for all of the hard work. I know it's a hard work because I've seen them do it in our office, back and forth and all of the emails. You both have really put a lot of time and effort into making this event possible, and I'd really like to thank you for all of that effort, as well as Lexi at the Center for the Study of World Religions. So I just want to start out by saying just many thanks. I'd also like to start by saying that the director of the Pluralism Project, Dr. Diana Eck, definitely sends her regards and her sincere apologies that she couldn't be here this evening to join us. She's traveling abroad in India, but this is exactly the kind of conversation that she loves to be having, this intersection of practitioners and scholars who study interreligious engagement. This is truly one of the inspirations for her for the Pluralism Project, this kind of work, and continues to inspire the work that we do. So without further ado, I think I'll turn it over to Professor Clooney. See if you can make it back.
Whittney has just said most of what I would have said on this occasion, so I need not draw things out too long. Add my word of welcome, my gratitude to Lucia and April for their hard work in bringing this program about. And I am particularly delighted on 2 other levels. One is the very fact, as Whittney referred to, the Pluralism Project and the Center for the Study of World Religions working together. I have, as director in the past 2 years, met any number of people who think that these are almost the same institution, even though they're separated by about a half a mile in Cambridge here, that the ideals of looking at pluralism, thinking about the diversity of our many cultures today, and then trying to bring them together, looking at them together and thinking about them together, are such harmonious activities that I do hope, as you, that we will be able to work together in many ways in the years to come. But secondly, this very important notion in Interfaith Week of the common ground, and both the vision, the reality that already exists, and the hard work of making it possible for us to find common spaces in which to work is such an important theme. And that too is a ground on which to build. And I think the conversation we have tonight will really be a base for thinking through the issues, the problems, and moving forward. So I think on all these levels, it's wonderful to be here. And again, I thank you all for being with us tonight.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is April Weinbrenner-Palo, and I'm a research associate at the Pluralism Project and helped put this evening together. As I'm sure we're all very excited to get into it, I would just like to provide some quick introductions to our panelists this evening before they will go ahead and share their thoughts with you. We've heard from Whittney Barth. She's the assistant director of the Pluralism Project, and she joined the Pluralism Project in 2010 and is an HDS alumnus and completed her Master of Divinity in 2011 and has held leadership positions with the Interfaith Youth Corps, the Chautauqua Institution, and the Harvard Interfaith Cooperative, among other things. Latifa Ali is the board president of Cooperative Metropolitan Ministries, a local interfaith organization, and is the first African-American Muslim woman to be named board president of an interfaith organization in U.S. history. She's also involved in a variety of Boston area African-American and Muslim community development projects. Dr. Jenny Peace is the assistant professor of interfaith studies at Andover Newton Theological School. She's the recent author of My Neighbor's Faith, Stories of Interreligious Encounter, Growth, and Transformation. She has held leadership positions with Andover Newton Center for Interreligious and Communal Leadership Education, or CIRCLE, the Interreligious Center for Public Life, the United Religions Initiative, the Interfaith Youth Corps, and Daughters of Abraham. Chris Stedman is the Interfaith and Community Service Fellow for the Harvard Humanist Chaplaincy. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Faithist, How an Atheist Found Common Ground with the Religious. He is the founder of Atheism and Interfaith blog Nonprofit Status and has worked with the Interfaith Youth Corps, Secular Student Alliance, Common Ground Campaign, and Foundation Beyond Belief. And last, Professor Clooney is the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at HDS and is the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of World Religions. He specializes in Hindu traditions in India as well as the Jesuit missionary tradition and has worked with the International Society for Hindu Christian Studies and the Society of Jesus in the United States and has written extensively on comparative theology. So I would just like to welcome all of our panelists and we can get started.
I want to make sure I was where I needed to be. Great. So what is common ground? That's a good question. And as I've grappled with this a little bit back and forth, going to our most recent research on looking at the interfaith infrastructure in the United States, I found there are a lot of different answers to this. And organizations across the country are answering this question in very, very different ways, often complementary ways and sometimes contradictory ways, but sometimes, and most often very constructive ways. At the Pluralism Project, I like to think of common ground as a recognition of our differences. Common ground is the starting point to common ground is recognizing those differences and then having a willingness to meaningfully engage with them. In order to recognize the differences and then to begin meaningfully engage with them, we have to learn about the other. And so that has really been the core work of the Pluralism Project for the last 20 years. The Pluralism Project is founded on the idea that in order to begin the work of interfaith engagement or begin the work of learning about one's neighbor, we need to know who is our neighbor, who is there on the ground with us. One of the resources I would lift up that this has been one of our flagship go-to resources is On Common Ground, aptly named for an event such as this, an educational resource that documents the growing religious diversity in the United States, recognizing that religious diversity is not a new thing, but the frequency with which we interact with that diversity is becoming an increasingly a frequent thing in reality for many of us. And so that really gets at the heart of what the Pluralism Project is all about as an organization that provides resources. Not only do we document the changing religious diversity in the United States, but also seek to provide resources for scholars, teachers, students, average Americans to engage with that religious diversity in their daily lives. And so On Common Ground, this resource, which I spoke of, includes maps, histories, timelines, essays, and videos looking at the changing religious landscape of America, also delving into world religions in America by tradition, and also looking at the challenges that arise when we begin to engage with one another in the public sphere, in community organizations, in our neighborhoods, and it's certainly an ongoing conversation. We're really excited that in 2012 we're going to launch On Common Ground 2.0, as we've been calling it colloquially, as a web-based resource that'll include GIS maps and census data overlays and things like that. So really offering a resource that can, we hope, help start the conversation and continue the conversation for people to explore the religious landscape of their own communities and of the nation as a whole. So what do we mean by pluralism? And what does pluralism have to do with common ground? Pluralism, as we think about it at the project, is a way of engaging with common ground, engaging with that difference. Pluralism has 4 components. Pluralism is engagement with diversity. It goes beyond diversity. It is an act of seeking to understand one another across our lines of difference, not negating those lines of difference, but trying to understand one another authentically across those lines. It's also an encounter of commitments. It's a willingness to bring your commitments to the table and to respect those who bring their commitments as well. And that can get messy. That's a very messy process, and often can bring its own share of challenges, but also its shares of opportunities as well. And finally, pluralism is based on dialogue and encounter, not necessarily on agreement around all issues. And so, as I was thinking a little bit about common ground, in thinking about what it means to engage with difference, rather than on necessarily agreeing on certain issues, I think we really get at one of the tensions within this, the concept of common ground, as well as one of the tensions, I think, in the interfaith movement itself, as diverse as it is. One of the questions I think comes up a lot in thinking about when we look at different interfaith organizations is what are participants being asked to do when they come into that space? Are they being asked to engage with theological difference and political difference, social difference, or what issues are bringing people together? Common ground, when we think of common ground as difference and not necessarily as agreement, it may bring more people to the table, but it also has the added challenge of if you want to, what does action look like in that setting? And so I think that's one of the challenges, I think, that arise when we think about that. At the same time, when we think about common ground as agreement on a particular issue, whether it's social or political or theological, we also have to think about who's not coming to the table because of that line that's being drawn. And so I think we see that being negotiated in so many different ways throughout the interfaith movement, which we're finding from our interfaith infrastructure study, which the website is going to be launched in the next couple of weeks, that those negotiations take on so many different forms depending on the organization, depending on their goals. I'd like to lift up a few examples. In Syracuse, the Alliance of Communities Transforming Syracuse, I think, is a great example of how the political aspect of the organization is preferenced as an interfaith organization, because it brings together, it's a coalition of community organizations, of unions, of religious organizations, to come together around social and political issues in Syracuse, whether it's providing sustainable or affordable housing or better jobs. Really, and they've had a lot of challenges with that. Some people don't want to join the coalition because there's a union. Some people don't want to join because such and such, so and so is there. So there are a lot of challenges and negotiations that happen within these organizations, and I'm sure some of our panelists can speak more to that negotiation as well from their own personal experience. And one of the organizations in Cleveland, Interact Cleveland, I'd like to lift up as an example of an organization that integrates well the idea of service and of dialogue, and really gets at this notion of not only a common goal or finding common ground in service, but finding common ground in dialogue as well. They always couple, whether it's working with homelessness, working to eradicate homelessness, or working to support young people. The work of the organization always includes dialogue and talking about what it is that brings people to the table to do this kind of work. And we see organizations struggling with that too, in terms of organizational identity. In Austin, an interfaith organization, we've written a case study for this Interfaith Infrastructure Project, really struggled with that idea and almost lost their sense of identity as an interfaith organization because they were focused so much on direct service. And so we see this back and forth, this negotiation of difference and of which aspect. I like to think of it as, we all come to the table as multifaceted individuals, and organizations are very similar in that they have multiple identities and multiple goals. And so thinking through some of those facets and which ones come to the fore at which times, I think, is really helpful in thinking about common ground. And finally, as we're thinking about common ground and thinking about common ground as difference, it's about a story of us. So throughout the United States history, we hear the quintessential, Protestant Catholic Jew description, and that becomes, the normative for American society or American civil society, and that becomes those differences are allowable, and then become Christian, Jew, and Muslim, and that becomes that's becoming more and more the go-to for interfaith engagement and the structure of, like I said, of this sort of civic identity in American society. But we're living in a much more pluralistic world now, and so I wonder what will the next story of us look like, and how will we engage with the idea of common ground, engaging with those differences in meaningful ways, in ways that include and recognize the fact that, of the interfaith organizations that we surveyed, 1/3 said that atheists, humanists, and secularists were involved in interfaith work, or the fact that Buddhists and Unitarians are the fourth and fifth most frequent to engage in interfaith work, at least in our study, preliminarily as a pilot study. And so I would like to leave with the question of what kind of story of us will we create, and what will that mean for our conception of common ground as difference? Thank you.
Hi. With the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. I wish I had the leisure of speaking from a scholarly perspective, but I'm a practitioner, and I deal with this stuff every day. And I would probably say my definition of coming together on a common ground changes weekly, depending on the issues at hand and who's championing them. Being the first Muslim woman to be part of an interfaith organization of this scale in such an official capacity is very an education in motion, really. And I remember when I first got inducted into the position, a woman came up to me at the end of it. They gave me a standing ovation before I said anything. And I pessimistically said, oh, it only goes down from here. And in the very end of my talk, a woman came up to me and she kind of whispered over the table and she said, don't worry about anything. It's going to be really challenging. And I thought, I'd been on the board for CMM for at least 2 years before I took the position of president. I served as the vice president of the board for a while. And I thought, this is a piece of cake. I've done this, been there. And really, the shift of position changed everything. It literally put everyone in a different position in terms of their own ground. And so it put me in the position where I had to both be fair and also push the envelope a little bit in a way that I thought would be useful to the organization in putting me in this position. And when I think of pushing the envelope from an Islamic perspective, one of the first things that comes to mind for me is that I'm a newlywed. I've been married for a little over a year now. And in our religion, part of our coming to being of self is that they say marriage is half your religion, right? And so you think of marriage as this one-on-one relationship in a Judeo-Christian perspective, and in Islam, it can sometimes take on multiple facets, right? But really, marriage is with everyone you come in contact with on some level, and therefore, for it to be half your religion, for you to come of age into your true self, you're going to have to interact with these people in a way. I looked up Webster's dictionary for this word common ground. They do have a definition of mutual interest and mutual agreement. So you have this marriage between interfaith organizations, and you're going to have your good days and you're going to have your bad days. But all of those days at the end are about you bonding and moving towards some common mutual interest. So I can't sit here and say that it's always flowery and it's always going to be nice. In fact, I would say that sometimes those most bonding relationships and times have been those that we've had the most friction. And that we've learned the most from, that we've had to, in the religion of Islam, it says that we've made you different nations and tribes so that you may know one another. But I've also thought of that deeply and thought, so you can know yourself. So what I've learned most about being involved in this common ground theory is that it has helped me come of age to whom I am as a person in a way that I couldn't have had it happen any other way. And I wouldn't exchange any of the experiences that led to this moment for anything. As a student, when I heard this idea of common ground, at first I thought, well, you're talking about interfaith in a different kind of word. It's a new jargon. It's the latest thing from Harvard or something like that, But, because I've done radio for some time, I always have to do my research. So I also went online and Googled this word, and I could find no common ground about this word. There were organizations called Common Ground Mission and the Common Ground America, and these organizations were very different. The mission organization represented a Christian interfaith organization. The America represented a political arm. I even Googled an organization through talking to some Muslims about this concept called Groundswell, which was a direct organization dealing with the concept of common ground, but coming up with the different issues that, from an Islamic perspective, they thought would help build this collaborative spirit and combat those things that they thought were tearing that spirit of commonality apart. So in doing that, I looked at it in two ways. I looked at what's the practical on-the-ground happenings that is happening with this movement, and also from a religious perspective, what is the historical text that we can lean on to kind of put it all in some larger perspective. So I'm approaching my talk from both of those. When it talked about multivocal, that was the first word that was kind of put in our question. And I thought, okay, when they say multivocal, what does that mean? Because when you're coming from the same cultural outlook, it means kind of a similar thing. But when you're looking at it from this multifaceted world of culture, vocal takes on many forms. And so from an Islamic perspective, there's a place in being vocal when you're in a situation where there's inequity and or an oppressive situation. And they said one of the things that you're called upon to do when there's some injustice that you need to champion is that you do something about it. You come together and you actively work to change something. But if you can't do that, then they give you another piece, which is to say something. And so you have this permission to kind of, if you're not able to do something, to feel comfortable with saying something. And if you can't say something, then there's another fallback that says, just feel bad about it in your heart. And in Islam, that's a very serious thing to feel bad about something in your heart, because basically you're calling on prayer and you're going through a plea direct to your Lord saying, look, I've expressed all these other things and here's the ultimate veto, And so this concept of prayer was also listed in one of the missions from one of the Common Ground organizations. And it said the idea of common ground in religion is that prayer is everything that you do. And from an Islamic perspective, people commonly think of us as doing 5 prayers a day, and if we're really good, we're doing 7, in a day. But there's this ritual regiment, but anything that we do, there's actually a prayer associated with it. So that there's also this concept that and one I've embodied is that you pray like it depends on God, but you work like it depends on you. And so this concept of work and prayer as kind of the 1-2 punch is a part of, I think, the Islamic inheritance that we bring to the table, that it's incumbent to do something, but it's also incumbent to, if you can't do something, that you would use this vehicle of prayer to change things. And that in using that vehicle of prayer, it's not the lower of these things. So when you have these cultures in America in particular, where you have, especially right now, so much assault from a media perspective, people are going to kind of take some kind of guard against these things. And I found that many of the cultures don't speak out as much as they could. They're kind of defaulting back to feeling bad in their heart because they're being isolated in some kind of way. But from many of the organizations that champion social justice, they're kind of saying, well, why don't you write that letter, telling these other groups that, that you're disregarding them. And a number of the Muslim organizations don't want to posture themselves in this way where they're championing all the things that are wrong that are labeled against Islam, because in some way that they don't have to, in a way. We've had these other mechanisms for dealing with inequities or oppression. And so when you're on a common ground where people are saying, well, okay, the most vocal is the most concerned, that's not necessarily speaking to the different cultures that are at the table. So when you come to the perspective as the first Muslim woman to sit on these bodies, and people are saying, well, why aren't they saying something, or why aren't they, reacting in this kind of way? There's a sensitivity that you have where you're saying, okay, well, this may be why they're reacting in that way, and not to think less of how much they champion this issue as it being important. So it's a really complicated coming together. It's really simple, but it's really complicated because there are all these other considerations that you wouldn't have unless you have someone at the table who's had some of those experiences to say it from a kind of organic perspective. Also, I think common ground has been with Islam forever. The Prophet, when he got his first revelation, he went to his wife, and his wife took him to her Christian cousin, who was learned in religion, because they needed some level of what's really going on here. Has this been prophesied? Is this valid? And so there's, in the history of Islam, there's always been this kind of, you are not alone in this. In addition, one of the first refugees to come out of Mecca went to the Abyssinian king for relief. who was a Christian king. So this idea that these religions are in a vacuum has really not been the case throughout history, but in this common media spin, it kind of seems like that. But it's not necessarily the way even Muslims think about their own role in activism. Another thing that came out, I was at a program yesterday for Shuttlesworth, who was this great civil rights leader along with Martin Luther King, and there was a question about the Occupy movement, which was also listed with Common Ground in many places on the web. And they were debating if this movement of Occupy, this Occupy movement was valid because they had no spokesperson, you know, and the union organizer who was there, who had led much of the labor reform that happened during Martin Luther King's time, was aback because he knows not to step on people's toes politically, but he postured and said that they don't need a spokesperson. He said just the fact that those young people have taken it upon themselves to move into these venues in such a real way in parks across the country to protest what they feel is inequity is just raising the issue enough for people to take heed, and those who have power to make a choice are now positioned to rethink what's going on. And so I look at that in the sense that even amongst our young people, there's a certain culture that if you're genuine about getting some results, you have to kind of be open to different ways of expressing that. And that, to me, is what Common Ground is about.
Thank you. So when April asked me to respond to questions about Common Ground and interfaith work, I started the way I think most of my students start when I give them a new assignment, and the way some of our panelists also approach the topic. I Googled it. And I love Google, not because it provides reliable or accurate information, not always the case, but because it provides this fascinating window on common usage. And so here is what Common Ground is, according to top 10 lists for Google. A bar in Allston, a New York City affordable housing nonprofit, a music festival in Michigan, a magazine based in San Francisco, a golf course in Colorado. This was one of my favorites, a virtual dance team on MySpace with over 1,300 friends. Center for Environmental Leadership in New Haven, which is a great group. I suggest you Google them. An organic garden supply store, a Christian church, and an HIV testing and needle exchange clinic in Santa Monica, California. So, confirming my suspicion and some of the comments of our other panelists, there's not a lot of common ground when we talk about what is common ground. Of course, it gets a little more on target if you put common ground, comma, religion into your search. And there's interesting articles about how do we find common ground across world religions? Or what is the common ground between science and religion? Or there were opinions about religious liberty in public schools that came up under this. And this is also where we find a link to the Pluralism Project's groundbreaking, work on common ground. Which Whitney mentioned. And I really appreciate the way the Pluralism Project has kind of defined this territory in the sense that they use this phrase descriptively to explain things as they actually are when it comes to the American religious landscape, rather than prescriptively, as if there's a set of rules or laws about what the common space ought to be. And so this is where I'll begin my own account and try to give you a sense of how things are when it comes to the landscape of my own involvement in interfaith work over the last 15 years or so. And I hope by giving you this little portrait of some of the pieces of my own work, you'll get a sense of what is compelling for me in terms of what the basis of my interest in this area is. So I started my active involvement in interfaith work in about 1995 I was studying at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, working on a doctorate in historical cultural study of religions. And I noticed a very dissatisfying disconnect between the academic study of and the actual practice of religion or religions. And this gap really led me to look for other opportunities and other modes of learning. And it led me to be involved with a fledgling interfaith movement started by the Episcopal Bishop of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, William Swing, called the United Religions Initiative. And before I knew it, and literally I didn't know it until after the fact, I was on their board as their first youth member, which was funny because I was actually at a board meeting and I said, just as a sort of observer, I said, I really think we need some youth on the board. And they said, well, you're on the board. And I said, oh, okay, well, it's good to tell people that. But as a youth member, I was tasked with bringing people together at annual conferences that we began hosting. Really, the idea behind the United Religions Initiative, for folks who don't know, was that the bishop at Grace Cathedral, it looks right across at Fairmont Hotel where the Charter for the United Nations was signed. And as in a commemorating event, he was asked to gather together the world's religious leaders as this sort of parallel to the world's political leaders. And he realized, we don't do that in religion. We don't get together. We have no standing bodies. We have no common ground where we meet. And it became this very burning and compelling question to him to think about why we don't have this kind of a body and what are some of the barriers and what could he do to overcome some of the obstacles. So he started this really interesting initiative, and I was just in the right place at the right time to kind of be involved on the ground floor with that. And I learned an enormous amount about what the interfaith movement is and what interfaith organizing looks like and what some of the pitfalls and opportunities are in that whole space. As part of that work, as I said, I was tasked with bringing young people to our annual gatherings, and I think it was either 97 or 98, a conference in Stanford, when this young whippersnapper, all of 17 years old, Ibu Patel, came to our conference as part of the delegation from the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago. And very quickly, a group of us young people, there were probably 15 or so, in late night sessions, dreamed up this idea for the Interfaith Youth Corps. And the sort of premise of that group was that young people need to be involved in this work from the beginning, as, at the heart of the work as full partners, not the kind of, trotting out for the prayers at the beginning and end of the ceremony that we sometimes felt we were being called upon to do. So in any case, I was involved with the leadership of the Youth Corps until about 2000. Ibu really established a whole nother sort of level and trajectory for the work when he took leadership in Chicago and built it into the organization we know today. It's done a lot of really groundbreaking work in kind of defining what is the common ground of interfaith work, I think. So fast forwarding from that period of very intense study and involvement and participation, I moved back from the West Coast to Boston. I had 2 children in a little over 3 years. I finished my dissertation work, and I worked part-time at an educational nonprofit, so I wasn't really doing anything other than sort of keeping the laundry going and feeding our family. But meanwhile, my mother-in-law, who had been a trust and estate lawyer her entire life, quit the practice of law and went to seminary, much to the surprise of all her family and friends. And she went to Andover Newton Theological School, where I teach. And so this is where it gets interesting. Edie was really responsible for drawing me back into interfaith work in 2 very concrete and important ways. The first was that she formed the Daughters of Abraham, which is a book group for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women. It was 9/11. She was sitting in First Congregational Church in Harvard Square, and they had called a service on the day of 9/11. In the wake of that tragedy, there was just a sense we need to gather. We need to get together. So they opened the church, and it was a very interfaith gathering spontaneously. And it turned out that my mother-in-law was sitting next to a woman on one side who was Muslim and a woman on the other side who was Jewish. And she found herself just so overwhelmed by this experience of communal grieving and this proximity and relationship that existed in that moment, and the lack of any spaces for that kind of connection to happen outside of that unusual and tragic sort of reason for the gathering. And she thought, what can I, little old me, do about this? And she thought, well, I know book groups, I know women, I could start a book group for women, Jewish, Christian, Muslim. So there was something what I look for in interfaith organizing and work is that kind of authenticity and fit between the founder and the work. So this was an idea that was perfectly suited to who she was and where she was and what she cared about. And I became involved with that work with her from the start. And 9 years later, I'm still in the original book group, and I'm part of the steering committee and the leadership team. I've learned a lot about that particular model through her connection to it. And the second way, and maybe more relevant for what I'm doing now, is that Edie was a very active student at Andover Newton, and she really helped found the interfaith work between Hebrew College and Andover Newton that is the foundation for what I do. It was called Journeys on the Hill, and it really was a very informal gathering of students saying, hey, you're studying to be a rabbi over there, and I'm studying to be a minister over here. I'd be interested in talking to you about that. And from that really grew all sorts of programs and initiatives and projects. And the way I got involved is that Edie, because of her previous work, drawing on those skills, helped the school apply for a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation. And she called me over to her apartment and showed me this grant that I was, happily, overwhelmingly dealing with having my kids and finishing my dissertation and doing this other job. So I was not looking for more work. But she showed me this proposal for this remarkable initiative between Hebrew College and Andover Newton. And I was getting more and more amazed as I read page by page. And then on the last page, she had crossed out her name where it said Interfaith Coordinator and wrote mine in, because the fact of the matter was that she was sick with breast cancer, and she passed away about 3 months after that. I'm just going to try and say that in a composed way. But she really was handing me the baton that I had handed in some ways to her. And I think in that narrative, that's sort of my story of how I found my way to my work. And there's sort of a life connection and an authenticity to how I found my way into my interfaith work. And again, that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in where people's biography and their passions really meet the needs in the moment and how that all unfolds. So, CIRCLE, Center for Interreligious Communal Leadership Education, that's the program that sprung from this Luce grant that Edie helped us secure, and it's been an amazing, amazing experiment. The foundation of it, and I'm not going to go into all the programming because that's a longer story, and I'm happy to answer questions about it later, but the foundation of it is a very simple premise: interfaith learning through relationship. We have this remarkable opportunity as we're neighboring schools to be there together for 4, 5, 6 years, depending on, whether the rabbinical school is about a 5-year program. So you can be there for really an extended period. Get to know people in ways that you just don't have the opportunity to in other circumstances, and in a period of your life where you're both in this formation process, which I understand is just such a rich period of possibility, where you're throwing out old assumptions, you're building up new ideas, and the potential for impact at that moment is just very profound. One project I'll mention that was mentioned in the opening was this book that's coming out in April called My Neighbor's Faith, which I edited. It would be great if I'd written the whole thing, but it's a collection of 50-plus first-person narratives by all sorts of folks, Paul Knitter and Mary Boyes, people who are educators and activists and community leaders involved with interfaith work from every conceivable vantage point and in every direction. So there's Muslims writing about encounters with Christians, and Buddhists writing about encounters with Hindus, and a young Sikh woman writing about walking into a little Christian church, and just, trying to change the directionality of who's the first person narrator. And what I'm excited about the book is that it really shows the power of personal narrative for finding common ground in unlikely places, and for also highlighting the fact that it's in our very particularity that we find those sort of common moments of inspiration. And if you're interested, on May 14th, we'll probably be having we will be having a panel with presenters from that book, and I can tell you more about that. So, having given you some sense of my own work in this area, I want to go back with just make a couple closing remarks to a distinction that I made at the beginning of the conversation between descriptive and prescriptive approaches to our phrase common ground. At the heart of my work is a concern that we lack common civic spaces where people can bump into each other and get to know each other across religious and other divides. At Andover Newton and Hebrew College, we're constantly designing all sorts of fancy programs and fellowships and curriculums, but it really boils down to creating these spaces. And that's where the magic happens. That's where the work can really begin. Once you're in that sort of, I like to think of it as the protective shadow of authentic friendship and genuine affection. And what I sometimes worry about is that we've come to expect or want a more prescriptive version of common ground, a least common denominator middle ground where religious particularism is shunned and interfaith relations stay at the level of avoiding conflict. I notice with my students in my interfaith classes sometimes that they seem to hold very tightly to similarities and get a little uncomfortable if we overemphasize differences, as if common ground, agreement, similarity is the only formula for healthy community. I'm really interested in helping my students imagine community beyond common ground, a community of others where common ground is not the price of admission. I want to help them cultivate a tolerance for ambiguity, an ability to hold both and, a comfort level with staying in the conversation even when there is no clear philosophical or religious common ground. My hope is that our real common ground might be simply a greater acceptance or comfort with radical, uncommon, irreducible differences, which we can experience as not threatening, but rather vital to solving the complex issues that confront our planet and her inhabitants. Thank you.
Well, hi, my name's Chris. It's my great privilege to be here. I feel like after those three remarks, there's probably not very much for me to say. Talking about common ground, right?
You're done.
You've said it all. No, but I just want to extend my thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's, like I said, it's my privilege to be here. Like Latifa, I consider myself much more of a practitioner than a scholar. I have written this book, as was mentioned in my introduction, called Faithiest, How an Atheist Found Common Ground with the Religious. So, based on that book title, I must have figured it out, right? I mean, I know what common ground is, so I'll just give you the answer, and or maybe I won't, and then you'll have to buy the book and you can read it and then find out what the answer is. No, I laugh almost every time I see that subtitle, because it does sort of give the impression that there's some equation for accomplishing common ground, as if it is this thing that we can attain, and there's a certain way of going about attaining it, and that some people have it figured out and others don't. And I'm not very comfortable with that impression, because first of all, I think it would be a bit arrogant to claim that I have figured out how to go about doing that for a number of reasons, but in particular because, unlike many of the folks sitting on this panel with me, I've actually only been involved in interfaith work for a few years. I am relatively new to this work and to this idea of interfaith cooperation. I'm very interested in this question of common ground for a number of reasons, in part because this question of what is common ground and how do we find it sort of dominates the conversation about the value of interfaith cooperation in the community that I'm a part of, the atheist community. So I sort of bear witness to this, conversation of what is common ground on a very sort of, common basis. And the question of what is common ground and what does it require of us is sort of the litmus test for a lot of folks that I meet in the atheist community about whether interfaith cooperation is something that they think they can get involved in. If common ground means having to concede certain things or hold agreements about certain ideas and values, there are a lot of folks who will not get involved. And of course, that's not exclusively true of the atheist community. I think that's true of the majority of the communities that I encounter in this work. But speaking from the perspective that I have as an atheist who does interfaith work, one thing that immediately occurred to me as I considered the questions that we were provided in advance of this panel is, for a lot of folks in the atheist community who may potentially be interested in getting involved in this work, the biggest stumbling block to doing so is the exclusivity of a lot of the language of interfaith organizations and the proponents of the idea of interfaith cooperation. In fact, the freshest example in my mind of this is from an otherwise very beautiful event that I attended last night, which was a celebration of the life and message of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is a part of this slate of events for Interfaith Awareness Week here at Harvard. Myself and another atheist were sitting in attendance, very much enjoying a lot of the program, but at a number of different points in the evening, we heard terms like, all of us as people of faith, or, in all of our religious traditions, we uphold these values. And we sort of turned to one another and, as individuals who are pretty, deeply involved in a lot of interfaith work, we kind of smiled and smirked a litlittle bit and sort of, neither of us felt this need to sort of get up and storm out, but we also recognized that there are plenty of other folks who would love to be involved in this kind of thing, but who would find that kind of language really uninclusive, and it would sort of prohibit them from wanting to be involved. So that has been a really big focus of a lot of the work that I've done in the interfaith movement over the last few years. As was mentioned in the introduction, I have worked with a number of different organizations, sort of most deeply the Interfaith Youth Corps, where when I first started there, I had a lot of questions about what it could mean for me as an atheist to be involved in interfaith work. And over the course of a couple of years of working with the organization, we sort of learned together what that could look like for myself and for other folks at the table. And I think the biggest and most obvious takeaway for me from that experience was that one of the most easy places to find common ground with other folks involved in interfaith work that I have worked with anyway is that interfaith work and the idea of common ground in interfaith work should not mean and cannot mean theological or ideological pluralism. That if that is the definition of interfaith work, not only are a lot of atheists not going to find a place for themselves in that work, but a lot of other folks will not as well. And I think what that means is things like interfaith worship or interfaith prayer breakfasts are going to be the kinds of events where a lot of folks like atheists are not going to find a place at the table for themselves. So for me, that has meant putting an emphasis on action in interfaith work, which is why the Interfaith and Community Service program that we operate out of the Humanist Chaplaincy here at Harvard was recently renamed Values in Action. We call it that for a couple of reasons. One, because we want to place the emphasis on identifying shared values through action. And if you notice Values in Action, the acronym for that is VIA. VIA means by way of or through. And so we tried to emphasize that through this action, which is in itself a sort of social good, we also accomplish finding sort of shared values with those we're working with and uncovering what some of the similarities we have are. So there's a common ground. There's sort of two kinds of uncovering of common ground that happen there, two kinds of interfaith work. One is the humanization of the other through acting together in unity and discovering common ground through this shared action and through the conversations that happen around it. And the second kind of interfaith work and kind of common ground is more of the sort of action-oriented, coalition-building, issue-specific kind of work. And that, to me, is where things get a little bit harder and a little bit more complicated. But it is my conviction that the first kind of interfaith work leads to the second kind. That through doing the kind of interfaith work that is perhaps, dialogue focused, that is about introducing and humanizing the other to an individual, that through that process, the kinds of shared values are uncovered that will motivate people to work to better the conditions of life for all people. And that is where interfaith work is able to be more about political and social issues than just about sort of identifying common ground. So I think for this reason, common ground is both a goal and a device. It is something that we can strive to achieve. It is the humanization of difference, but it is also something that we can use to further other goals that we have, other social issues or political issues. And I think, because I think in my mind, the first, again, is sort of easier, and I think that's sort of where things need to start. In a world that is fractured and divided around religious identity, and in a country specifically that has the highest rate of religious diversity in the world, but also the highest rate of religious illiteracy in the world, that kind of work is very, very important. And without it, I think the second kind of interfaith work probably isn't possible. So I think this idea of common ground as a goal and a device leads to the understanding that certain kind of work perhaps needs to be prioritized first, this kind of humanization work, and then the second kind of work will come hopefully as a natural outgrowth of the first kind of work. But as I said, I'm a practitioner more than I am a scholar, and the practitioning work I do, the work that I do besides the sort of interfaith community service programming that I coordinate for the Humanist Chaplaincy, and as a part of the larger Harvard Interfaith Cooperative, that is one arm of the work that I do in the world, but the other is in storytelling. And we've heard a good number of stories this evening, and that is sort of where I feel the most comfortable, at least in this point in my career, is in sharing stories that accomplish the first kind of common ground uncovering, which is the humanization of difference. So I actually want to share two pretty brief stories relatively quickly. One is about sort of a surprising but relatively easier discovery of common ground, and the second is a slightly harder one. And both of them relate to my sexual orientation, my being a queer person. So the first was actually as I was preparing to move out here to begin my work at the Humanist Chaplaincy, I was leaving Chicago, where I had been for a number of years, where I had done my master's in religion and had worked with the Interfaith Youth Corps, and so, I had developed a really wonderful community there, and I had to take sort of a few weeks to say goodbye to folks and sort of put that, put a period on that chapter of my life before I came out here. And one of the friends that I was saying goodbye to was a very good friend of mine named Ben, who I had met in some of the seminary classes I had. And we became very good friends for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons we became very good friends is because we lived in the same neighborhood. And that sort of geographic proximity allowed us to discover common ground, and we ended up finding out that we had a lot in common. But one of the things that we didn't have in common is that he was a straight man and I am a gay man, and he had not ever met a queer person before he and I had become friends. And so I think he was like overcompensating for this because there was this little gay bar in the neighborhood, and every time we hung out, he insisted that we would go there. I don't even like gay bars that much. I mean, some of them are great. This one happened to be really great, but it's not like that's the only place that I want to go hang out. But I was okay with it. I knew it. He was like, it was a well-intentioned kind of thing, and I think it made him feel good. So I was fine with it. So we went to this bar that we always went to sort of have one final, hanging out, and we were saying goodbye, and we were having, just this long, drawn-out conversation about the last couple of years and everything we had learned together, and it was sort of an emotional kind of thing, and of course. One of the biggest things that we spent a good amount of our friendship working around was this idea of finding common ground across lines of religious difference and across lines of sexual orientation and all of that. He's a Christian, I'm an atheist, and so we were having this really in-depth conversation about all of this, and somebody was listening in, and at one point they apparently were so intrigued by what we were talking about that they felt the need to inject themselves into the conversation. And it was a man who identified himself immediately off the bat as a Christian. And he was very curious about why I, as an atheist, was interested in this idea of interfaith cooperation. And we ended up having actually a very great conversation. But at one point he posited this question that I always think about. It's not so much the content of the question, but the conversation that we had to follow. He asked me, okay, this is all, he said, this is all well and good, this sounds great, but, I just can't help but want to ask you this question. It's just been on my mind the whole time. And, he's like, okay, so you're an atheist. Can you tell me how all of this came to be, how all of this got here, why it's here? And, I paused for a moment and, of course, immediately realized that this was not a question I had spent as much time thinking about as perhaps I should, because I didn't have an elevator response for him. So, I paused and I said what has now become a favorite line of mine if I don't know the answer to something, which is, I'm not a scientist, so, but what I can say is that question, the question that you've asked, legitimate and important question, but it's a question that to me has become increasingly less interesting the older I've gotten. It's a question that I used to spend a fair amount of time thinking about, and more time thinking about, where I was, not how everything got here, or how I got here, but where I was going, where I was going to end up. But that question is increasingly less interesting to me, because I look at the world around me and I see a world full of, incredible joys and profound challenges. And I'm, much more interested now in the question of not of how we got here, but given that we are here, however that happened, what are we going to do? What will we do with our lives? What will we do with the lives of those around us? And he paused for a moment and, sort of surprised me, but he, just took me in his arms, gave me this huge hug and said he agreed. But, that his sort of reasoning for caring about what we will do while we're here was different than mine, because he had a sort of very strong conviction about how we got here and what we were supposed to do while here. But our questions, we had sort of we started from a different point. We came to a sort of convergence on the importance of what we are to do while we're here. So that to me is a sort of easier way of finding common ground, to say, our starting points are different, but we have the same conclusions. The harder way, or the harder occasions to find common ground is when our conclusions or our values are different. And so the second story I want to share is about, it took place almost a year later, not quite, when I was on my first speaking tour. I did a speaking tour of about 8 colleges and universities in the Midwest, sort of a trial run for the book that I have coming out later this year, trying out some of the material. It's a great experience. As somebody who does not live for public speaking, it was a good opportunity to get more comfortable with it. And, for the most part, it was a very good experience across the board. A lot of challenging, thought-provoking, but generous questions after my speeches. But there was one occasion about midway through the trip where, after the event, a young woman came up to me after everybody else had cleared out and I could tell as she approached me that she was kind of a little bit nervous. She had been hanging back, waiting for everyone else to leave. And, she said to me, thank you for coming, and, your speech was very interesting, which was a nice thing for her to say. But, I feel compelled to let you know that there's a demon inside of you making you gay. And the reason I know this is because I had a demon inside of me that gave me a gluten intolerance. And I prayed for that demon to vacate, and it did. And so you could do the same thing. And I know, you said that, just for some background, I am a former born-again Christian. When I was much younger, I was very a fundamentalist Christian and spent a long time. This is something I write about in the book, and this is something I spoke about at the event, but I spent a long time believing just that and sort of, trying very hard to pray the gay away. And it didn't work. But she basically said, I know you said you tried, but you just didn't try hard enough, and, God wants me to tell you that the demon's still there, doing its gay demon thing, and that, I need to let you know this. So, right. I mean, I had two instincts, two different ways that I sort of thought I might respond. The first was to laugh, because I thought it was sort of a silly thing to say. Just from my own, perspective, I think that that's not true, and that it's kind of a silly connection between my sexual orientation and her gluten intolerance. And that, it would be well within my rights to sort of, almost to call that what it was, to call it ridiculous and sort of mock it, right? And then my second instinct was to sort of get angry and to say, to put sort of essentially almost put her in her place and say, no, what you've just said is very dehumanizing. You need to know how wrong this is, and to sort of, express some of my anger at the same time in a very cathartic manner. And as I was sort of sitting there debating between these two responses, my sort of emotional reaction cooled a little bit, because I took that moment to pause. And in doing so, while I was pausing, I remembered how nervous she had seemed when she approached me. And I looked over at her, and I saw that she was kind of shaking a little bit. She was, very scared. I recalled that when she had been telling me this, there had been, marked quiver in her voice, and I realized, she was kind of nervous about telling me this. And so, instead of getting angry or instead of mocking her, what I said was, thank you. And I wasn't, I actually meant it. I wasn't just sort of being facetious, but I said thank you, because I know how hard it is to tell someone something that you think they don't want to hear, but that you think is really important to tell them. Something that you think is, perhaps even life or death, right? And, I know that, especially given sort of our power dynamic here, you're going out on a limb, you're coming up to me, and you're telling me this thing that you think is very important for me to hear. So I just want to thank you for your bravery and for your honesty. I'm glad that you came and that you are telling me what you really believe, instead of sort of pretending that difference, that disagreement's not there. And I noticed that she got a little less nervous once I said that. And once I had opened that door, then I, of course, went into an explanation of why I didn't believe that was true. I sort of shared more of my experience, as a former born-again Christian and as a queer person. And, I would love to be able to bookend the story and say, and she walked away and her opinion was totally different. And, that's where we found common ground. And that's not where we found common ground. I mean, she still, when we left that conversation, she still believed that there was a demon inside of me. But that wasn't all she saw. She didn't see me as just this demon anymore, right? I mean, she saw me as a human being who had experienced pain, who had experienced, who had struggled, who had been challenged. And so, I can't help but hope that as she continues to work through this, and as she thinks about this issue in the future, that now this encounter, this, as you said, this vulnerable sort of sharing of an experience, that she will attach that memory and she will attach the human being that she knows to, the idea of homosexuality in the future. That now it's not just a word that she reads in a book or hears from a pulpit, but that it's a person that she thinks of, and it's a story that she remembers. And, so that the common ground, I think she went in thinking our common ground, right, was that we both had demons, or one of us still did, and the other one didn't anymore. But instead, the common ground, she found another place of common ground, which is that we had both experienced these sort of things that are central to the human experience, the struggling and striving to find meaning and striving to live a life of purpose and to find happiness. And so, though there was no easy resolution to that experience, I think that the transformative possibility of that kind of encounter can't be underscored enough. And I think unfortunately, too often those kinds of potentially divisive moments do go down that divisive avenue, and that opportunity is lost to uncover the common ground, not of agreeing about the morality of homosexuality, but the common ground of simply the experience of being human. As I said, I consider, though I'm not, I think I have a lot of growing to do, but I consider one of the things that I enjoy the most and think has the most potential to impact the world in a positive way to be this idea of sharing vulnerable experiences. And so, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my remarks, I've recently completed a book called Faithiest, which is primarily memoir. The end of it does sort of unpack the issue a bit more of atheists being involved in interfaith work, and it does draw on some scholarship. But the majority of the book is about how I ended up doing the work that I do now as a queer atheist, humanist, interfaith activist. And this book has been a dream of mine since before I even got actively involved in interfaith work, and I never thought that I would be able to write this book for a number of reasons, because my impression was that common ground meant, the sort of easy, we're all sort of agreeing on things, perhaps it's theological pluralism, and, I thought that my identity as a young queer atheist who, is not, I didn't go to Harvard for my degree, and I was the first person in my family to go to college, first to get a master's, and so education is not sort of seared into my bones. As my mom is wont to remind me, I'm covered in tattoos and plugs, and that's potentially alienating to some people. And so, I always thought that who I was too divisive. And I even heard from some folks when I first started getting involved in interfaith work that perhaps, you're not the best spokesperson for this kind of work, or you're not the person that we want facilitating a dialogue because, your story is going to alienate people sort of from the get-go. But what I've actually found is that because I have sort of forced myself to be very vulnerable about the experiences that I have in the book that I have written and in the speaking that I've done, that those things that I thought were going to be so divisive, because I attached them to my human experience, have actually been the things that have helped me uncover common ground with others. So we'll see where it goes from there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So going last in a session like this makes me aware, first of all, that I agree that so many wonderful things have been said already that need not be repeated, and I couldn't have said them as well as my colleagues up here. And also that time is short, and that we want to give a few minutes at least for you all to jump in before heading to the reception across the street. So let me make my points really briefly, and then we can proceed from there. I come at this, I think, with a sense of agreement with the previous speakers, that the common ground is not an empty vacuum. It's not a space that is void, neutral, where everybody leaves behind the things they care about and they come kind of unprotected or totally without the beliefs and practices and so on. But it's a rich, mixed, complicated space, in that we come into this space not because it's entirely neutral, but because we've decided for various reasons that we can work together, talk to one another, share that ground. My own background makes this likely. This is what I like the way I like to think of it. I'm Roman Catholic. The Roman Catholic tradition, I mean, it's a very big church, but it's also a very complicated church with a range of teachings and range of values, the rituals, the practices, the beliefs, and so on, are all very material. And to have it kind of neutralized or neutered would certainly not be the way to proceed. And for 40 years now, I've been studying Hinduism. And that my study of Hinduism over the years has put me in touch with another tradition, which is very complicated, very large, very material, very rich in all its details. And the sense that the coming together of traditions, if it was to mean leaving all of that behind for the sake of something neutral, would be a great shame. I mean, my instinct about seeking common ground is, in many a case, to worship in my own space in a Catholic church, and then go to a Hindu temple. And that the back and forth movement across from one sacred space to another is very enriching, rather than simply to say, let's go to a place that is none of our sacred spaces and neutral in the middle. The second point I would make is that I think it helps in many a context, particularly when we're not in a room like this, where my sense is that most of us agree on these points and have a lot in common among ourselves as we're here. What are the reasons why we can talk to one another? What are the case that can be made for coming together? And I'll just tick these points off. One is we can say that it's natural. I mean, we're human beings. We have a lot in common. And that the differences that divide us, regardless of our religion, our culture, our language, our orientation, whatever, never stand in the way in the fact of being human. And that this is something we all have in common. And nobody with any good religious sense would want to deny that today. Secondly, we're reasoning, rational beings. And when we talk to one another, when we think, there is a logical possibility, there's an ability of conversation, there are ways that we can make the case. And once we're able to translate and cross linguistic boundaries and other boundaries, we find that, in fact, we can begin to understand one another. And that there are no barriers deep-rooted in our cultures or religions that make understanding impossible. I really do believe by hard work that we can cross these boundaries. So these issues, it's simply natural, it's reasonable, often can serve to make the case why we can talk. Following from the second, it's also a matter of what is true, what is real. And this goes back to some of the points about, why creation, or how did the world come to be the way it is. And I don't think we need to say that we all need to move to a single fixed account of the way the world is, but in some case to say that everything that is true converges. And that truth brings us together, the nature of the world in some way that we all experience, we all think about, we all live in, we all die in, somehow is there for us, and none of us is the inventor of it, even if we construct it in our own ways. But what is true, and what we can sort of put before one another, sometimes confront one another with, enables us to build this common ground. Because the reality around us is not simply a fabrication, but it's there before us and it's there after us. And then fourthly, I mean, there are the reasons in faith, and we talk about these in terms of different traditions. We talk in terms of our sacred scriptures, we talk in terms of what God wants, we talk in terms of our experience. Faiththeism, perhaps, would be another way to put it. And I think on the one hand, we have to realize that often when we're talking, others in the room may be uncomfortable because we're either consciously or not tapping into language that's sectarian, and we may be oblivious to how somebody else is receiving it, as Chris was saying. But also, that's the language we have, and we have to be able to speak with our own accents, with our own words, our images, the poetry of our traditions, and go with that, being aware that then the person who speaks with us will do it from their own background. And I think not to be offended by the fact that we have these different accents, different faith traditions, however they're imagined, and simply to be aware that the problem would be if the common ground only gave some of us permission to speak and nobody else permission to speak. That would be the problem. But that I speak with my accent and my faith and my Catholic background and my study of Hinduism is a good thing, provided I allow others to speak to me from other angles. So I think these elements, the natural, the reasonable, the true, the faith perspective, can help us to talk this common ground. But my third point is that even when we've done all of that, there is the complicated work of constructing the spaces for these conversations. And I realize that, while there are these great and noble events like the World Parliament of Religions, where you sort of get everyone to come together for a time, far better are smaller initiatives even thinking of the conversations we could have up and down the table here, we'd probably enjoy different conversations among different pairs of us or different triads of us, because these relationships are different, and the deeper we go into our stories, realize that the dialogue is not one dialogue, the common space is not one common space. As I said before, I go from Catholic spaces to Hindu spaces and back in a conversation with a Buddhist or a Muslim or anyone of other traditions. It's worked out differently. And this is the hard work of the detail of bringing it to fruition. And that the common ground, the instinct of having one table with everybody around the same table, is probably a good vision, the heavenly kingdom, one might say, from a certain tradition. But short of that is, how can we find ways to talk to some of our neighbors in some depth, some of the time? Not saying the only reason I'm talking to you is because the others are unimportant, but because I can only do this. This is the only possibility for me now, and to work this out in our individual ways. And my final point is just to highlight some examples of the cautiousness that I think comes in the Roman Catholic tradition, and then one local example at the end. The World Council of Churches is a wonderful ecumenical organization which for its entire career the Catholic Church has refused to join. And I think there's this hesitation of becoming part of a larger organization that somehow does away with religious difference. And yet the Catholic Church has established all kinds of networks of committees being in different conversations and so on, but won't join. And while this in some ways can seem mean-spirited in kind of sense of, we're special and so on like that, and we can't be part of that. On the other level, there's an instinct that can be respected that the common conversation, if some people are not willing to plunge into it and be there all the time, allow people to connect in different ways, and even something as big as the Catholic Church to connect in its own ways. The second example, Cardinal Joseph Bernardine, Cardinal of Chicago, who died some years back, he established the Common Ground Project among Roman Catholics. And this was an effort to say that Roman Catholics across the spectrum could get together and talk. And it was incredibly difficult, and I did some Googling myself on this, and it's still controversial that this is really a wonderful thing, or this is something that's not even Catholic, and perhaps he was under the influence of Satan when he founded this project, because we have nothing in common. Those liberal Catholics have nothing in common with us. Those people are so far to the right, they're not even Catholic anymore. And this is an example, I think, because it realizes that the common ground making begins at home, and that among the different smaller communities to which we belong, with our immediate neighbors, our immediate friends, our churches, our temples, our conversations on Sunday or Saturday or Friday or Thursday night, whatever they are, is that sometimes that practice of finding a way to talk to the people we're closest to and often have the hardest or most passionate differences with enables us then to grow beyond. And I think in some way, being part of and understanding what Cardinal Bernardine is saying, if we could just get Catholics to talk to one another, opens the door to saying, then we can have and learn better in all these other conversations. Third example, Assisi. In 1986, John Paul II called together a meeting of religious leaders in Assisi in Italy, where Francis of Assisi kind of spoke about this ground of harmony. A wonderful vision, which was much less successfully repeated last year on the 25th anniversary. Turned out to be rather dull, I think. But the vision of the 1986 one was that we can come together, our differences are not done away with, we look different, we act different, but the open challenge at the end of that is, can we actually pray together? And the uneasiness that was there among many of the Roman Catholic representatives, including the current Pope, is come together, pray separately. And I think one of the horizons of common ground is to find a way in which we come together because we're human, because we're rational, for all kinds of reasons, but at some point to say, can we enter a spiritual space together where in some sense we risk ourselves in a space that is not our control, it's not under our hand, but it's a sacred space, a holy space. And the Catholic Church has always in some way indulged in that, but also pulled back because there's this fear, what would happen if we were praying with a Muslim or with a Hindu and so on, or entering a space where we pray theist, atheist together, what would that even mean? And then finally, a local example, and this is advertising, education, that the work of dialogue, the work of finding the common ground is a process that needs to be built into how we study religion, how we think about the process of learning religiously. And so on Thursday, in the center, we have an open conversation. You're all invited. The multi-religious MDiv, a conversation. And we brought together people in our own MDiv program, both professors and students, which is now Christian, Hindu, Muslim, humanists, all kinds of traditions together, but people from Claremont, Chicago, Union, Seattle University, Hartford Seminary, together to talk about how do we educate people both in their own faith and the ability to cross the boundaries, to practice their religions in common, to preach and respect the differences in the way we preach, to learn in the same classrooms and see the differences. How does this work out as ministerial training? And the kind of plotting detail of trying to do that is sort of saying, well, now it's not a common ground, but 10, 20 years from now, as products of these programs go out and minister, we'll be in a very different space than we are tonight. Even though things are optimistic, there is a long way to go. So I will stop with that. Thank you.